The year was 1863, and the air in New York Harbor tasted of salt and false promises. I stood on the deck of the steamer, my wife Moira's hand trembling in mine, while our young son, Sean, slept heavily against my shoulder. Through the iron-gray drizzle, I saw it. The copper skeleton of the Statue of Liberty, rising like a hollow ghost against the skyline. To us, it was the gate to a new life, a sanctuary from the hunger of the old world. To the men waiting on the docks, however, it was merely a funnel for fresh meat. A man approached us as we stepped onto the pier, dressed in a tailored wool coat that smelled of expensive tobacco and authority. He looked like an angel of mercy amidst the sea of desperate, mud-caked faces. "Welcome to the Union, son," he said, his voice as smooth as Irish whiskey. He spoke of immediate citizenship, of a guaranteed tenement in the city, and a stipend to keep my family fed while I settled in. All I had to do was sign the Naturalization and Housing Registry. I didn't just sign it, I embraced it. I looked at Moira and smiled, believing I had finally secured our future. The betrayal didn't come with a shout, but with a heavy slam of a sliding timber door. Less than 24 hours later, I wasn't in a factory or a brickyard. I was being shoved into a cattle car bound for Virginia, the stench of manure and damp uniforms replacing the hope of the harbor. As the train lurched forward, I caught one last glimpse of Moira on the platform, her face a mask of pale terror, clutching Sean to her chest. She didn't understand why they were taking me. Neither did I. But as the iron wheels began to scream against the tracks, I realized I hadn't signed for a home. I had been sold to the slaughter. Before we continue with this journey into the dark heart of the 1860s, I ask you to join our ranks. This channel exists to honor the memory of those who were lost in the shadows of history, men like Liam, who fought battles both on the field and within their souls. By subscribing and hitting the notification bell, you help preserve these stories of sacrifice and survival. Let us ensure that the names of the common soldiers are never forgotten. Your support is our strength. The transition from the hopeful decks of an immigrant ship to the mud-choked hell of Camp Griffin in Virginia was a descent into madness. I arrived under a sky the color of a bruised plum, the air thick with the acrid scent of damp canvas, unwashed bodies, and the metallic tang of thousands of stacked rifles. My uniform, a coarse blue wool that bit into my neck like a parasite, felt less like clothing and more like a shroud. I was no longer Liam O'Connell, a father and a husband. I was a number, a piece of property sold by a man in a silk hat to satisfy a quota of flesh. The drill sergeants were wolves in human skin, their voices rasping from screaming orders that were designed to break our spirits and weld our shattered pieces into a singular, mindless machine. We marched until our boots were soaked in our own blood, and we learned to load the Springfield 58 in the driving rain until the motions were as natural as breathing. But while the boys around me wept for their mothers, my heart was turning to flint. Every night I sat by the flickering campfires, sharpening my blade and staring north. I had received no letters. The money I was promised had never reached Mary. The realization that my family was likely starving in the tenements while I was being trained to die for a cause I didn't choose fueled a cold, quiet rage. I wasn't just learning to be a soldier. I was learning how to be a predator. If the only way back to New York was through a wall of Confederate lead, then I would become the deadliest thing on that battlefield to ensure I survived the trip. The Virginia mud doesn't just stick to your boots. It seeps into your soul, heavy and cold. I remember the smell of New York Harbor, salt, horses, and the intoxicating scent of promise. Now, that promise has been replaced by the acrid, choking stench of black powder and rotting timber. I wasn't a citizen of a new world, as that aristocrat in the fine wool coat had led me to believe. I was a receipt. A piece of paper signed in a mahogany office meant some wealthy man's son stayed in his parlor while I was shipped south to bleed in a blue coat that felt like a shroud. They called us substitutes. To the high command, we were expendable meat purchased to fill a quota. As I sat by the guttering campfire, sharpening my hunting knife until the edge could split a hair, the anger was the only thing keeping the damp chill from my bones. I watched the green recruits tremble at the sound of distant cannons, but I felt only a frozen, sharpening focus. My war isn't against the men in gray across the field. My war is against the man who sold me into this hell. During the skirmish at the tree line, the world dissolved into a gray hell of smoke and screams. 3 rebels lunged through the haze, bayonets leveled at my chest. I didn't feel fear. I felt a calculated mechanical rage. I parried the first thrust, drove my blade into the second man's throat with a sickening thud, and used his collapsing weight to unbalance the third. When a panicked supply horse bolted under artillery fire, threatening to trample our own wounded, I threw myself at the reins, wrestling the terrified beast into submission while Minié balls whistled past my ears like angry hornets. The sergeant called it gallantry. He was a fool. It wasn't for the Union, and it wasn't for the flag. It was the realization that I am the only weapon my family has left. If I must become the most lethal shadow on this battlefield to survive and get back to New York, then God help anyone standing in my way. The mud in Virginia has a way of swallowing a man's soul before the lead ever finds his heart. It was the autumn of 1863, and the air smelled of wet wool, sulfur, and the metallic tang of blood that never seemed to leave the grass. I sat by a dying fire, cleaning the lock of my Springfield rifle for the 3rd time that day. In this hell, your rifle is your only honest friend. It doesn't lie to you like a man in a fine suit with a silver tongue. I remembered the face of that aristocrat in New York, the way he smiled as I signed those papers, promising me a future, a home for Mary and the boy. Instead, he sold me into the belly of the beast as a substitute, a piece of meat to stand in the place of some rich man's son who was too precious to bleed. Everything changed when a fresh batch of replacements arrived, shivering and wide-eyed. Among them was a man I recognized from the docks back in Manhattan, a tailor named Miller. He looked like a ghost, his face gaunt from hunger and the journey. When our eyes met, he didn't see a neighbor. He saw a dead man walking. He told me what I had been fearing every night in the trenches. He spoke of the 5 points, of the filth, and the desperation. He told me that my family had been evicted 3 weeks after I was shipped out. The officer who had recruited me, the man I now knew as Mr. Sterling, had never sent a single cent of my pay to them. He had pocketed the enlistment bonus and let my wife and son be thrown into the gutters. Miller had seen Mary begging near the piers, trying to find work while our son burned with fever in a drafty tenement basement. A cold, hollow silence settled in my chest. It wasn't the kind of fear you feel when the canisters of grape shot are tearing through the trees. It was worse. It was the realization that I was fighting for a flag that didn't care for me, under a command that had stolen my life. I looked at my hands, calloused, stained with black powder, and realized I had become a very efficient killer for the wrong cause. I had spent months learning the art of the blade and the rhythm of the skirmish. I could ride a horse better than any of the cavalry scouts because I didn't care if the horse or I survived. I had made a name for myself in the regiment, not out of bravery, but out of a desperate, suicidal efficiency. They called me a hero during the last charge at the Sunken Road, but I wasn't charging for the Union. I was charging because the sooner the battle ended, the closer I was to finding a way out. That night, the plan began to take shape in the dark corners of my mind. I couldn't just desert. They'd hang a deserter before he crossed the Potomac. I needed to die. I needed Liam O'Connell to disappear in the smoke of the next engagement so that a ghost could walk back to New York. I began to watch the picket lines with the eyes of a predator. I noted the rotation of the guards, the frequency of the patrols, and the location of the best mounts in the officers' stables. There was a bay stallion, a beast with lungs like bellows and a heart of iron, kept near the colonel's tent. That horse would be my ticket to vengeance. During a skirmish 2 days later near a dense thicket known as the Devil's Garden, the opportunity arrived. The Confederates opened up with a battery of Napoleons, and the woods turned into a meat grinder of splinters and lead. I didn't take cover. I moved forward, deeper into the gray haze, away from my unit. I found a fallen soldier whose face had been taken by a shell fragment, unrecognizable. I swapped my letters and my dog tag with his, leaving the identity of Liam O'Connell on a corpse in a ditch. I crept back toward our camp under the cover of the retreating chaos. The smoke was so thick you couldn't see your own hand. I found the stables. The guards were distracted by the influx of wounded men screaming for water. I didn't use a gun. I used my knife, the one I'd sharpened every night until it could shave a hair. The sentry never made a sound. I slipped into the stall of the bay stallion, whispered a prayer into its ear, and led it out into the shadows. I had managed to stash a sack of hardtack, 3 boxes of ammunition, and a heavy cavalry cloak I'd liberated from a supply wagon. As the sun began to peek through the charred trees of Virginia, I wasn't a soldier anymore. I was a hunter. Every mile I rode north, I felt the weight of my rifle against my back and the cold steel of the knife at my belt. Mr. Sterling thought he had bought a substitute, but he had actually paid for his own executioner. The war was behind me, but my personal battle was just beginning. I could still see Mary's face in the moonlight, and I swore to the heavens that if I had to burn New York to the ground to find her, I would. New York City, in the winter of 1863, didn't smell like the citizenship I had been promised. It smelled of coal smoke, rotting refuse, and the same desperate poverty I thought I had left behind in Ireland. But I wasn't the same man who had stepped off the Erin's Isle months ago. My hands were calloused by the Enfield rifle and stained by the dark earth of Virginia. My soul was harder than the bayonet sheathed at my hip. I moved through the shadows of the 5 Points like a ghost, my eyes scanning every shivering figure huddled under the canvas awnings. When I finally found them, my heart, which I thought had turned to stone in the trenches of Fredericksburg, shattered. Mary was huddled in a doorway near Water Street, her beautiful face gaunt and gray, clutching our son, Seamus, beneath a threadbare shawl. They were living on the very edge of existence while I had been fighting a rich man's war. I knelt before them, and for a moment, the war-hardened killer was gone. I pressed my canteen to Seamus's parched lips and felt Mary's trembling hand on my bearded cheek. "Liam?" she whispered, as if speaking to a phantom. "I'm here," I said, my voice a low rasp. "But I cannot stay yet. Not tonight. Hide in the cellar of the old bakery we knew. Stay hidden. Stay quiet. Just one more night, Mary. After tomorrow, we leave this city and never look back." I left them with a loaf of bread I'd stolen and a promise that tasted like copper and rage. I tracked Julian Vane, the officer who had sold my life for a bounty, to a gilded taproom on Broadway. He was exactly where I expected, surrounded by mahogany, fine brandy, and the hollow laughter of men who profit from the blood of the poor. I watched him through the frosted glass, my hand instinctively checking the balance of the heavy Bowie knife tucked into my belt, the same blade I'd used to clear Confederate pickets in the dead of night. He looked soft. His skin was pale, his silk waistcoat unstained by the mud of the Rappahannock. He didn't see the predator in the rain-slicked coat watching him from the darkness. When he finally stumbled out into the freezing drizzle, leaning on a silver-topped cane, I followed. He lived in a brownstone that cost more than a regiment's worth of lives. I let him unlock his front door, let him step into the warmth of his foyer, and before the latch could click shut, I was inside. The click of my pistol's hammerback was the only greeting he received. He turned, his face flushing with indignant anger that quickly curdled into a sickly, yellow terror as he recognized the man he had sent to die. "O'Connell?" he gasped, his voice thin and reedy. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a long speech. I pressed the cold muzzle of the Remington against his throat, forcing him back into his study. The room was filled with the scent of expensive tobacco and stolen dreams. "The money vein," I said, my voice as steady as a firing line. "Every cent of the enlistment bounty you pocketed, and then the interest for my wife's hunger and my son's sickness." He tried to bluster, tried to offer a bribe, but I pressed the steel harder until a bead of blood bloomed on his white collar. He scrambled to a wall safe, his hands shaking so violently he missed the combination twice. When it finally clicked open, he pulled out a heavy leather pouch and a stack of Union greenbacks. I took it all. It was a small fortune, more than enough to buy a homestead in the West, but it was barely a fraction of what he owed me for the piece he had stolen. "Please," he whimpered, falling to his knees. "You have the money. Just go." I looked down at him, and for a second, I saw the faces of the boys I'd buried in the Virginia mud, boys who were only there because men like Vane needed substitutes. "The war reveals who we are, Julian," I whispered, "and I am the man you created." I didn't use the gun. It was too loud. I used the knife, quick and silent, a soldier's mercy he didn't deserve. I left the house through the servants' entrance, disappearing into the fog before the body was even cold. The city was waking up, the bells of the docks tolling a mournful rhythm as I returned to the cellar. Mary and Seamus were waiting. I didn't tell her where the gold came from, and she didn't ask. She saw the look in my eyes, the look of a man who had finally finished his service. We didn't take a carriage. We took a ferry, then a train, heading toward the setting sun. As the skyline of New York faded into a gray smudge on the horizon, I felt the weight of the rifle leaving my shoulders for the first time in years. We were heading to the territories, to the wide-open spaces where the air didn't smell of gunpowder or betrayal. I had been a soldier, a victim, and a killer. Now, for the sake of the two people left in the world who loved me, I had to learn how to be a man again. The war was over for me, but the scars would travel every mile of the way to the west.